I want to start off by saying this calligraphy here. This calligraphy comes from possibly one of the most moving moments of my adult life. That was painted by Takahashi Korekiyo. It was painted by him on the birth of his grandson Korenobu in February of 1929. 2 years ago, Korenobu called me on the telephone and said, "Dick, I have a present I want to give you." He came around to my apartment, which is just down the street here in the Keio housing, and he handed this to me. And he said, "This was painted for me by my grandfather the day I was born." I said, "You can't give that to me." He said, "My daughters don't appreciate it, so you take it, you appreciate it." So I almost started to cry, although you're not supposed to cry, but I almost did anyway. So let's go to slide number 2. Is this how I do it? What should I use?
I think on the
Okay, behind me. Thank you. Okay. I should make a correction here. I'm certainly not chair of the history department. I haven't been for 20 years. And I'm also not a professor anymore. I'm a professor emeritus. I retired as of this past spring. But nevertheless, I'm showing you these 2 books because the first one on the right is the cover of my book that came out from Harvard in 2007. On the left, you see the Japanese translation of the book, which came out 3 years later. And I particularly like it because I like these pictures of Takahashi. The one on the left is taken in his garden, and I'll tell you where his garden was in a few minutes, toward the end of his life. Abe Shinzo says that Takahashi Korekiyo is his model, and that's why I'm here to talk to you. And that's why I went this past weekend actually to Shimonoseki. How many of you have been to Shimonoseki? I ate more fugu in 2 days than I've ever eaten in my life. And here I am. But he was the first branch manager of the Bank of Japan office in Shimonoseki in 1893. And so I got invited to go down along with Koda Main. Any of you have been reading her, read her novel, serialized in the Tokyo Shimbun and then published as a 2-volume book. I envy her. How nice it is to be a historical novelist rather than a historian. They can make stuff up. Really. Now, some people think I did, but nevertheless. Now, this is, of course, why we're here, as I said to you a few minutes ago, because Abe Shinzo has said that Takahashi is his example for doing what he's doing. The extent to which that's true or not we'll come to as the talk goes. Now, I objected to this slide, by the way, because as you may know, pre-war Japanese ministers had uniforms, cabinet ministers. And Takahashi was an anti-militarist, and I always disliked the idea that they portrayed him wearing a uniform, which he wore on very, very few occasions for formal portrait cabinet events and that sort of thing. But what I want to talk to you about is who this man is. I've lived with this man for about 25 years. My dream is that I'll get involved in a time machine. Michael J. Fox will come with the Mad Professor, and they'll take me back to talk to Takahashi 100 years ago. But this is a man who rose to the top of the Japanese government. Prime Minister, 7 times Finance Minister, Governor of the Bank of Japan. And he began life as an illegitimate child. His father was a goyo eshi, a house painter in the shogun's palace, in castle, where the emperor now lives. His mother was a 15-year-old family maid. Daddy was sneaking down into the pantry, and the results of this was Takahashi Korekiyo. The family decided that they couldn't afford him. They couldn't afford another son. They already had 5, so he was adopted into an ashigaru family. Those of you who know Japanese history know that an ashigaru is about as low as you can get and still be a samurai. In fact, many people think that ashigaru are not bushi, but are lower than that. But basically what Takahashi was adopted into was a hereditary private in the army family. If he had been born at a different time, he would have risen in life from being a private in the army to being a private in the army when he retired. But luckily for him, things happened which changed his life. The first one was at the age of 10, he was sent by his Han, his domain, by Sendai Han. He never went to Sendai, but nevertheless. By the way, Takahashi was born in Minato-ku, raised in Minato-ku, died in Minato-ku. He is a real citizen of the ward, Tokyo ward that we are in. And I identify with that because I have a connection with Keio. And from Keio, you can walk to where he was born, where he grew up, and where he died in 20 minutes in different directions. But at any rate, at the age of 10, he was sent to Yokohama to study English. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of James Hepburn, because there's a Romaji system that he created that still exists today. Well, Takahashi's first English teacher was Clara Hepburn, James Hepburn's wife. Then he was a houseboy for a Scottish banker named Alexander Allen Shan. Then he went to San Francisco, spent a year and a half there, where, as the Japanese like to say, he became a slave. He didn't actually become a slave, he became an indentured servant. He mistakenly signed a contract. The contract said, he said later on, it says something about 3 years. What does that mean? Well, what it meant was that he was contracted to this family to work for them for 3 years as a houseboy. He escaped because, of course, in 1867, 1868, indentured servitude was no longer constitutionally legal. He came back to Japan, and he became under the wing of several important, well, a number of important early Meiji Japanese leaders. His first mentor was Mori Arinori, the modernizer some of you are familiar with, also studied in the United States and Great Britain, and actually proposed that English become the language of Japan rather than the Japanese. And Guido Verbeek. How many of you have heard of Guido Verbeek? Guido Verbeek was a Dutch-American missionary. He's a very important figure. In 1860, he went to Nagasaki, and many of the major leaders of the Meiji government, Okumo Shigenobu, Saigo Takamori, Ito Hirobumi, a number of other important leaders were his students in Nagasaki. Then in 1869, he came to Tokyo, where he became the head teacher in something called the Daigaku Nanko, which is the forerunner of Tokyo University. This is a school of Western studies, and he became the primary teacher there. Takahashi moved in with him and became a student, a houseboy student. At the age of 14, Takahashi Korekiyo became a teacher at the school, at the Daigaku Nanko, a primary educational institution in Japan. This 14-year-old kid became the assistant professor. No tenure, but still an assistant professor. He had never been to school. He becomes a teacher in the major Japanese school, but he had never actually been to school. Why? Because he had learned English. And he had learned English not by going into the classroom, as many of us do. He'd learned English by talking to people, and people at all levels of society, not just elite people. When he worked in this house in Oakland, California, he spoke English with the Irish cook and the Chinese laborer. When I get in this time machine, I want to hear what his English sounded like. But he was fluent in English. So when the Meiji government, obviously in the 1870s, what did they need? They needed people who could speak the primary foreign language at the time. So he became very important as an English language teacher, as an interpreter. He interpreted for important Oyatoi Gaikokujin foreigners who were brought to Japan to teach the Japanese about this and that. And he also wrote Japan's first patent and copyright laws in the 1880s. Yes. You can actually get the copyright and patent history of the US Patent Office, and he's in there because he took the US ideas back to Japan. And he was the first patent commissioner in Japan in the 1860s. Now, it sounds like this guy learned English. He was badly educated, but he learned English and he was on the way up. That wasn't that easy. This is one of the things that fascinates me about him. Maybe identify with him. At the age of 12, he had a drinking problem. I didn't start that quite that early. Well, my parents maraschino cherries when they had their drinks, and so maybe I did. Anyway, he between this job at the Daigaku Nanko at the school in 1869 and joining the Bank of Japan in 1892, so in 23 years, he held 16 different jobs. 8 in the private sector, 8 in government. Now, one of the important ones, of course, was writing copyright and patent laws. But at the same time, he did other things as well. For example, he was a hokomochi for a geisha. That is, he carried her shamisen when she went from assignation to assignation. He was a stockbroker, and he tells us in his memoirs that he was a crafty stockbroker. He treated different customers differently depending on how much money they invested. So this is a guy who had a very, and the thing which some of you may know about, in 1889, a bunch of Japanese thought they should not just buy stuff from Western countries, they should develop their own sources of natural resources abroad. So they bought a silver mine in Peru. And Takahashi was sent to Peru to run the silver mine. Well, it turned out, as you might expect, there was no silver in the silver mine. The Spanish had carried it all home 200 years earlier. And he had to come home from Peru in 1890, not only flat broke, but with his reputation totally destroyed. But in 1892, he joined the Bank of Japan. Now, how this happened, I don't have time to go into how he went from being a bankrupt mine manager to joining the Bank of Japan. Can't tell you exactly why, but there's one thing you should keep in mind. How many of you have been to the Bank of Japan building? Good. Do you take trips there? The Bank of Japan building, built in the I think it was completed in 1897, designed by Tatsuno Kingo, who also did Tokyo Station, same architect. Is a really interesting building. If you haven't been there, you should go. And you should also go across the street to the Money Museum, or the Bank of Japan's Money Museum. But Takahashi entered the bank to manage the building of this building. It was not being built fast enough. There were many cost overruns, and he was hired to manage the construction of the building. And it turned out that Tatsuno Kingo had been his English language student some 20 years earlier. And then in 1893, he finally makes it into the bank. He finally gets on the mainstream, you might say. And he goes to Shimonoseki to be the branch manager. The first branch west of Osaka, he goes to be the manager. From there on, he becomes vice governor of the Bank of Japan. Oh, one other thing happened along the way, which we were talking about earlier over supper. In 1904, Japan goes to war with with Russia. Takahashi is chosen by the Japanese government to go to New York and London to sell Japanese war bonds. So think about this. Who's there? This is Takahashi from Japan. I'm here to sell war bonds. We just gone to war against Russia. Are you crazy? But in fact of the matter is that he was successful at this. Now, there are lots of reasons why, and I don't have time to go into that now. But let me tell you that 47% of the cost of Japan's victory over Russia in 1905 came from New York, London, and then later Paris and Hamburg financial houses. Basically, New York and London paid for Japan's victory over Russia. Takahashi was the key player in selling these war bonds. I think what he learned as a stockbroker helped him here too. Okay. In 1911, he becomes governor of the Bank of Japan. In 1913, he becomes finance minister for the first time of 7. In 1922, he becomes prime minister. And so all of a sudden, this guy who had started off with this checkered career has risen to the top. And I think you understand what the key is. Why did this guy who was too low-ranking to go to samurai bushi schools where they studied Chinese classics, and too old to go to Tokyo University, how did he rise to the top of the Japanese government? And I think there's one word: English. He could speak the primary foreign language of the world at the time. Now I should add, he also had a very convivial personality. Very unusual, not just Japanese, but unusual anybody. I mean, my wife says I chat people up too much, and maybe I do, but he had no trouble with this. Let me give you an example. In 1904, oh wait, before I tell the story, how many of you know who Lily Langtry is? Lily Langtry.
Yeah. Teacher.
Lily Langtry was a
Teacher.
English actress
What actor?
who had been the mistress of Queen Victoria's son before he became Edward VII. And after he became king, he dumped her, and Queen Alexandra took her place. But Lily Langtry was his mistress. And then after she was no longer with the crown prince king-to-be, she became an actress, and she went to the United States and toured. And on the ship coming back, her trip back from New York to London in February 1904, she and Takahashi strike up a shipboard conversation. And you know, the idea, I mean, of this Japanese man striking up English conversations on the deck of ships. This is something my wife says I would do, but this is very unusual. And of course, the next year he had an audience with Edward VII, and one assumes he didn't tell Edward VII he met Lily Langtry several years earlier. But the point is that not only could he speak English well, but he had no hesitation, no qualms about using it. He liked people, he liked to talk to people, he liked to drink, he liked to eat. He's a very large man, if you've ever seen pictures of him, by Japanese standards, a very, very large man. Now, what he's famous for, of course, is what he did in the 1930s, and what Prime Minister Abe models himself on is what he did in the 1930s, which was to use fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies to bring about economic recovery for Japan. But before we switch to that, I want to talk about the fact that he was already thinking about this much earlier in his career. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a man named Maeda Masana. Maeda was a Satsuma samurai who proposed in the 1880s that Japan develop its modern economy not by top-down heavy industry borrowed from Western countries, but by modernizing its existing industry like silk and tea and this sort of thing. And Takahashi was his disciple. And these were guys who believed that the government should invest money in economic development, but that local businessmen should make the decisions about how to use it. I mean, think about that. Government putting money into things and not controlling how it's used. And their view was that local businessmen, local officials, have a better idea about market conditions and so forth than bureaucrats do. So Takahashi believed from early in his career, one, that Japan should develop itself from the bottom up, not from the top down. But he also believed that the primary goal of government was helping the economy grow. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term fukoku kyohei, rich country, strong army. Well, Takahashi, in a letter to Shinagawa Yajiro, a high government official in 1886, used the term fukoku yumi, rich country, prosperous people. The U is the U of yo-yu. Mean is, of course, people. So fukoku yumi, not fukoku kyohei. You make the country rich by making the people rich. And of course, what he's introducing here is something that he talked about later on, as we'll see in a few minutes, the multiplier effect. That is to say, if people spend money, if they buy things, the people who get the money buy things, and it has a multiplier effect, and it really leads to growth in the economy. Okay. In 1931, Takahashi becomes finance minister for the 5th of 7 times in the depths of the World Depression. Japan, like every place else, is having a dramatic fall in employment, in wages, in investment, and what do you do about this? Well, Takahashi did what John Maynard Keynes said some years later you should do. You devalue the yen to stimulate exports. You increase money in circulation to make more money available for people to spend. And then you begin a fiscal stimulus. That is to say, you spend money. And how do you spend money? You spend money by borrowing it. So the government budget is possibly only 75, 80% funded by taxes, and the rest is funded by borrowing. And he also went a step further, which is controversial even today, and that is he proposed selling bonds to the Bank of Japan, not on the open market. The idea being if you sell them on the open market, you absorb money that could be used for investment from the private sector. So if you sell them to the Bank of Japan, what they're doing essentially is creating more money, and then later on, when the time is right, they can be sold on the open market, but you don't do it when you're trying to increase money in circulation, increase the size of the money supply. So Takahashi proposes this in the 1930s. But I want to say something that I think is very important here, and that was that even when he's doing this, he believes that the initiative has to come from the private sector, not from the government. The government can put the money out there, but they don't decide how to use it. That is to say, he really is, as I like to say, he's both Japan's Keynes and Japan's Hayek. That is, there's a Frederick Hayek side to him, because he really is committed to the idea that markets are more efficient ways to allocate resources than government bureaucrats are. Okay. This, of course, is where Abe Shinzo comes in, right? Well, let me say, first of all, it worked. I guess I'm not that out of my talk. It worked. As you can see, in 1930, GDP shrank by 23%. That's not in real terms, that's in nominal terms. But from 1931 to 36, the economy grew. As you'll see, I have two charts here, and the figures are slightly different because they were taken from different sources. But basically, from 1931 to 36, GDP grew in real terms by about a third. How many countries in the world in the 1930s could talk about 5 or 6% real growth per year? Probably none of them. We have a number that economic historians say this, I little nerds. I already told you how he did it. So the first arrow was devaluing the yen. The second was fiscal stimulus. He also had the support, and I think this is important, of important people in the private sector. Now, I've put up 4 people here because I know more about them. I'm sure there were others. One is Ishibashi Tanzan, the editor of the Toyo Keizai Shinko, the Far Eastern Economic Review, who had published Keynes, what was it called, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, where in 1925 or 6, when Great Britain went back on the gold standard, Winston Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Britain went into a recession immediately after going back on the gold standard. So Ishibashi was a person who did not believe in contracting the size of the economy. He believed in growing the economy. He was one of Takahashi's supporters, obviously. Next in was Keigo, who was an unusual ally because he was vice governor of the Bank of Japan. You wouldn't think of a central governor talking about expanding debt, but nevertheless, he also understood something that a lot of central bankers don't, which is deflation is every bit as dangerous as inflation. They both have their downsides. And then on the left, you have two prominent business leaders from the time. Ikeda Seihin, who was the head of the Mitsui Enterprises, who actually tried to democratize Mitsui. He actually put Mitsui's shares on the market in the 1930s, for example. And Muto Sanji, who was the head of the Kanebo Silk Company, and then later became an economic journalist, and then was assassinated. Anyway, so he had his allies in the private sector, and this is important. Okay. This brings me to my climax. I want to read you two quotes. I'm going to read these quotes to you and then make a little comment on them. The first quote comes from Andrew Mellon. How many people know who Andrew Mellon is? Well, if you're from Pittsburgh, as I am, you know. Andrew Mellon was the head of the Mellon Bank. His father, I think, or grandfather, I'm not sure which, had been the founder of Mellon Bank. If you've ever been to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., one wing was given to the U.S. by the United States by Andrew Mellon, the newer wing by his son, Paul Mellon. So, you know, even rich people can do good things. But he was Secretary of the Treasury at the very time that Takahashi Korekiyo was finance minister in the early 1930s. And this is his comment on the Depression. Quote, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. This will purge the rottenness out of the system. High cost of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live more moral lives. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from the less competent people. Pretty harsh medicine, isn't it? Now, Takahashi Korekiyo. If someone goes to a geisha house and calls a geisha, eats luxurious food, and spends 2,000 yen, we disapprove morally. But if we analyze how that money is used, we find that the part paid for food helps supports the chef's salary and is used to pay for fish, meat, vegetables, and seasoning, and the cost of transporting it. The farmers, fishermen, and merchants who receive the money then buy clothes, food, and shelter. And the geisha uses the money she receives to buy food, clothes, cosmetics, and to pay taxes. If this hypothetical man does not go to a geisha house and saves his 2,000 yen, bank deposits will grow, but the efficacy of his money will be lessened. But the man goes to a geisha house, and his money is transferred to the hands of farmers, artisans, and fishermen. It goes in turn to various other producers and works 20 or 30 times over. From the individual's point of view, it would be good to save his 2,000 yen. But when seen from the vantage point of the national economy, because the money works 20 or 30 times over, spending is better. In other words, it's the duty of the nation to go to a geisha house. So let me conclude by saying that I think the time has come for Japan, and I might add the US, which I also spent a lot more time than I do in Japan, to go to a geisha house, not live Mellon's moral life. But to do so carefully, if you go to a geisha house, you have to know when to go home. Because if you increase fiscal stimulus, you have to know when to stop. You can't keep doing it forever.